Well, hello and welcome to the Watkins Museum. This is as time goes by. As you may know, we've had 3 segments talking about the development and growth of Lawrence, and we're going to continue today with a look at those war years, World War II, and how Lawrence became a part of that picture. So stay with us. I'm going to go in and talk to Steve Jansen, the director, right now. Back after this. Well, welcome back. I'm here with Steve Jansen in his digs.
Yep.
You're at home here.
Glad to have you here.
Hey, this is a wonderful place.
I knew if I could get you here, you'd like it.
I have to wonder how many people have missed this.
Well, that's why I'm so grateful for you for bringing them here.
Well, hey, thank you for letting us come. One of the reasons we came, of course, was to talk about World War II.
Right.
And I think you made an off-camera remark about the significance of those war years in terms of decades.
Well, they're really, as historians of American society, you know, what's the watershed of the 20th century? And you can think of the 30s and the Great Depression, but really historians tend to point to the 1940s as the decade which fundamentally divides the 20th century.
And it changes everything.
Right.
It changes.
And it does in eastern Kansas and Lawrence and Douglas County, for sure.
Yeah, and that's what we want to focus on.
Right.
It's a wonderful picture here behind me, a great photograph. When was this taken, or do we know?
June of 1945. That's the first published photograph. The war plan had been here for over 4 years, but of course, due to wartime security, no pictures were ever published of it. And with the prospect of the war coming to an end, finally, literally just at the tail end of the war, they've allowed this picture to be in the journal World in 1945. And it shows a 10,000 acre, 16 square miles is what the sunflower plant was, and we still see it today when we drive along Highway 10 into Janson County along the south side. Right. And this was, to give you an example of what 16 square miles means, Lawrence wasn't 16 square miles to 1980. So literally in 1941 and 42, this is on a scale that Lawrence and Douglas County, and for that matter, Janson County, had never seen.
As the Ordinance Plan, of course, this brought in a lot of people, new people, didn't it?
Right. The headline read, who would have guessed it? The old hometown has turned into a boom town. And it said, when we used to walk down the street, we knew everyone we met. And now we feel lucky if we know 1 in 50. And that's what I always say is the point of continuity between 1942 and 1996, is when we walk down the streets of Lawrence today, we don't expect to see people we know.
True.
That began with the sunflower plant in 1942.
So it really went from, I wouldn't say a sleepy town, but a small town in many ways,
right,
in its attitude and spirit, to a growing town,
right,
developing.
And there was money to be made, there was real estate to be sold, there was goods to be merchandised. Within the first year, receipts went up by 65% in the city of Lawrence. And actually they lost workers because men were going to the war, women were going to work at the sunflower plant because it paid 85 cents an hour, and all of a sudden you're being asked to stay open till midnight because the sunflower plant has a triple shift. And so literally movie theaters, grocery stores, we'd consider it normal today because we're a 24-hour economy, but that was really unusual for that time.
And by the way, that 85 cents an hour wasn't bad.
Oh, it was great money.
It was good money.
And see, that really changed the industrial climate of Lawrence, because if you will, you'd had a sedentary market where people were tending to leave, growing by 500 every 10 years, so you could pay what you wanted to pay. And all of a sudden you've got a federal government competitor. People literally went from paying $5 a week for a housemaid in a laundress, and that person could go out and make $5 a day out at Sunflower. And so you can see people are quick to make choices when you presented with that kind of disparity.
It comes to economics.
Right, right.
Well, I know you, it's obvious, but explain to us why they chose Lawrence, Kansas for an ordinance plant, which is a place where you make arms,
jet propulsion powder is, and they were making a very explosive item. And we'll talk more about that later.
Well, you said it was a boom town, but I don't think it's...
No, they didn't mean it that way, though it had the prospects of becoming a boom town if it all had exploded. But basically, Kansas went from being in the middle of nowhere, which is, of course, where we were economically and industrially. I mean, not so much economically, but industrially, we were not a prime industrial location. Well, all of a sudden, you're faced with the prospect of German and Japanese bombers. And if you want to protect them, put them in the center of continental United States. And so we went from $160 million in Kansas in industrial production in 1940 to to 580 million in industrial production by 1941, and this plant hadn't even opened. So the war boom had already started before the Pearl Harbor.
Because we knew it was coming, or because we thought we'd be a part of the economy of it?
This, of course, is a historical debate, but I think Franklin Roosevelt and national security officers knew that it was entirely probable that if we weren't going to be actively involved, we were going to be supplying the Allies. Yeah, so one way or another, we were going on a wartime footing.
And the rumor goes all the way from that supposition to their saying that the president actually knew about this incident before it took place at Pearl Harbor. But we don't know.
No, but the important fact, as you and I were talking before off camera, is that whatever opposition to the war that existed before Pearl Harbor, when Pearl Harbor happened, we were attacked.
Yeah.
And the country rallies together, and that certainly galvanic effect was true in Lawrence and
changed
Douglas
a lot of
County.
minds, didn't it?
Right.
There were a lot of people of German heritage in northeast Kansas, and in Lawrence in particular, in those days. What happened to them when the war started?
Well, you know, they'd already been through the shock troops of World War I.
Yes.
I mean, Ernest Cassold, which today means a street, but back then meant the proprietor of the West End Grocery in World War I, had his grocery store painted yellow. And a man named Wiedemann ran a very ice cream and confectionery store. He committed suicide. Now I'm talking World War I. So they'd already kind of dropped their Germanness by in the 20s and 30s. They don't really pick it up again, and they're very much more low-key. So when World War II happens, actually, I think there was probably less visible discrimination towards German Americans than had been the case with the First World War.
Right. The Japanese Americans were quite a different story.
Oh yes, and we had some Japanese Americans brought here, and I consider it to be one of the cruelest episodes of American history, the treatment of Japanese Americans, but that was largely a West Coast phenomenon. But we have people in our midst today who've moved to Lawrence who bear with them the scars of internment and of being deprived of their property and going through the deprivation of their constitutional rights. And so because of that galvanic effect, when people are in a wartime situation, in a sense it brings out the best in people, but it also brings out the worst in people.
Isn't it amazing, or maybe it's not amazing, but it's certainly interesting, that when there's a war developing or when there is enmity between governments, that the people within those nations can turn into hate mongers for the people of the other nations who under any other circumstances would consider them friends or allies, as we do today with people from Germany and Japan and even Italy, which entered into the World War as well.
And yeah, it's in a sense.
I mean, I know that's editorial, Steve, but it's something that I've always wondered about. I wonder why we go beyond the government, the political, into delving into why these human beings would not like each other on that basis, because there were some really scurrilous things said during World War II against people of Japanese heritage. I mean, what we called them, and the Germans as well, you know, they were the Jerrys or whatever, you know, and worse.
Well,
and
but the ironic thing is that your point is well taken, and I completely agree with it, but that came back to haunt us because we were sending African Americans over to fight. And here the African Americans hear how this is the fight of freedom and democracy against the Aryan totalitarians who are racist, and we are standing up against racists. And then they come back to Lawrence, Kansas, and are told to go upstairs and sit in the theater in the traditional colored section. So in a sense...
At midnight, by the way.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, for the midnight show.
Right, and we're triggering something, you know, whether we believe propaganda or not, propaganda has effects both on those who are meant to be directed towards and those who, in a sense, hear it. And so ironically, while we stereotype the Germans and the Japanese and deprive them of their humanity, we were putting into motion a social change that we've been wrestling with ever since.
Yeah. Let's talk about women's roles in this during this time. Women had to adapt in a great way, didn't they? I mean, it was big changes came about as a result of World War II.
Yeah, and I think that's where we get into this watershed issue. If you were a woman, you could work before you were married, before 1941. But you were expected once you were married that, quote, you would drop your job and become the homemaker.
That's right.
And in fact, it was thought to be critical to the economy that married women not be employed. Well, then the World War II breaks out and women are being told, married women are being told with children, are being told that their loyalty, their patriotism is in question if they don't respond to the critical need for workers. 60% of the people at the sunflower plant are women. They're the ones that are pushing the angel buggies, and they called them angel buggies because if you had bad luck, the buggies were going to send you to the angels.
That's right.
And there's an article in Reader's Digest called Hell's A-Popping in Kansas, and it talks about how women in the sunflower plant in eastern Kansas have the best safety record in American industry, because what they did, and if you look at this picture, you see lots of little buildings. Well, women were put into those buildings, and the thought was, well, there'll be an explosion, but it'll only be in one small building.
Oh, no.
So if you centralized industrial production, you would have had huge factory buildings. But they deliberately designed this in a way so that, in a sense, the wartime production effort would continue.
Well, they weren't dummies, were they?
No, and the powder girls, such as Frances
girls.
Cleveland and many others that have given us their help, excuse me, tell us of being sent out there and what a tremendously demanding and challenging opportunity it was. They felt like they'd been pushed to the limits, but they grew. And I guess the point I'd make to you is, once you've allowed people to grow, to be challenged and to respond to an opportunity, after the war is over and you, quote, try and return to normalcy,
Can't do it.
you can't go back. The genie is out of the box.
Before the women went to work in the plants, there was, as you say, the woman, her contacts might not go far beyond her own family,
Right.
and maybe the backyard fence, as we stereotype
Right,
women
right,
in those
right.
days. Now she meets everybody.
Right.
Now she meets new people at work. There are, of course, romantic involvement for both married and single, I presume, in those days, just as there are now. So as a result, one of the big changes that I remember coming about nationally from World War II was the increase in the breakdown of marriages.
You bet.
Divorces increased, didn't they, numerically?
Right, and that's the whole thing. I mean, one of the workers remembered that the men would come up to her, married men would come up to her and show her pictures of the kids, and then 5 minutes later make a proposition to her. You know, I mean, it was a very chaotic situation. The men are gone for the duration. Children are growing up. Bill Tuttle at KU has written a book called Daddy's Gone to War, talking about what it was like for children to be deprived of their main male figure for 4 or 5 years. And so women, you know, the rate of women smoking cigarettes, the rate of women operating single-family households, all of that is, in a sense, foreshadowed by the war. And when kids are let out of school, from New York School and Pinckney School and Quincy School in Lawrence, there's nobody at home. So the phenomenon of latchkey children
Really started there.
You're right, exactly. And people thought, well, it's just wartime necessity. You know, to give you an example, mothers were urged by the Lawrence Outlook to not let the children go out and play before 9 o'clock in the morning in the summertime. Now, summertime for us, the doors are down, the windows are down, we've got the AC cranked. That's why I always say Kansas history should be divided into BAC and AEC, before air conditioning and after air conditioning. Excuse my sidebar there, but
that's your background.
In the 1942-43 period, the kids are out there cranking their bikes up and down the streets in their wagons, and so mamas are urged to keep the kids indoors, but mamas are not there most of the time. There are a lot of them out at sunflower plants. So who's minding Johnny and Jane?
It has to change things, and it does.
It does.
And as you mentioned, you see it in the habits of women and in the changes in women. The clothing changes.
Right.
We saw women for the first time in what they called slacks in those days.
Right.
You know, out of the skirts. But if you look at most of the pictures preceding World War II, and even of civilians during World War II, you see women in skirts almost always. During and then after World War II, the development of changes in clothing and shoes and so forth. One of the things that I did want to mention, and we'll talk about it before we take a break, is the slogans. You used one just now. Did you realize you used a cliched slogan from World War II? You said during the duration, or through the duration. They always referred to the duration, which meant as long as this war lasts, right? And there were some other great slogans, Steve.
Don't you know there's a war on?
Yes, sir, I knew it, but I just had to have this extra
Loose
thing.
lips sink ships?
Oh, I'm sorry, I missed
Yeah,
it.
and it's, but that's I mean, Americans are highly individualistic, but the threat of this war, and you know, and they followed it on radio, and they followed it on the movie reels when they went to the movie theaters, and the sense of 2,500 people out of a population of 25,000 in the whole county, 10% of your population, men and women gone. I mean, it affected everybody's life. You went by the windows, you saw blue stars for men and women in service. It was a tremendous time.
You bring us to another point, and we want to come back with that. We've talked about the war in terms of our memories and what happened, and it was in many ways a good time for America. It was a growing up time, but it was, after all, a war.
Amen.
And Lawrence, just as other communities all around the country and of course worldwide, lost a lot of people in that war. We're going to take a break, Steve. When we come back, we'll be in front of the memorial here for those who died during World War II. So stay with us. We'll be back right after this. Welcome back. I'm with Steve Jansen, of course, the director of the Watkins Museum. And Steve, in the first place, the whole display for World War II is fabulous. I have to tell you that, and we're going to see a lot of it during this program. One of the things that is impressive has to be what we see behind us here. It's called the Douglas County Roll of Honor. Why did you do this? What was the point?
Well, I think obviously we were inspired probably by the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., because that's taught us that the listing of the names is a way of recognizing the individual contribution. And then by listing those who died in service, that's a special way, and we've raised theirs out a little bit so that their contribution is even more prominent than those who just enlisted. But what we tried to do was to, by definition, any list is an incomplete list, and people have been pointing that out to us. But we appreciate that help, and we've set up a World War II reminiscence book where we encourage people, and veterans and people who grew up during the war, to record their memories. But if you will, this is a way of recognizing each name of the people who served. We have the campanile on the University of Kansas campus, which is an architectural symbol. But by listing these names, we think we sort of, as Americans, we appreciate individuality. The best way we can recognize that individuality is to list the names.
I think you put it just right, because when you think about Campanile, and it is a war memorial, but then it doesn't go beyond that sometimes. I mean, it's wonderful, it's there, and it's good that we do these things. But this takes you directly to the person that was involved. And you know, you can't come by and put your hand on it and feel of it like you can the memorial in Washington. But I would suggest that a person come and take a look at this. You may recognize some names here, and there will be some people who are now older people who are walking around the town, or who you may know, or that are neighbors of yours, whose names are on here because they were in this war. I think the big thing, Steve, and this is one of the things that this whole display shows us, is the remarkable disruption that this war brought to these people's lives. It's one thing to say it brought a disruption to the community and to the town and to its, to the industry and all that, but these people's lives, which may have been focused on marriage, may have been focused on going to university or college somewhere, or the work that they were going to do, suddenly that's over for now, for the duration.
Right, and we've created jargon. We call it now post-traumatic stress syndrome. Well, they used to call it nervousness when he came back from World War II. Right. He had the jitters, or he was having a hard time adjusting. But in a sense, each person has to weather those storms themselves. And we've kind of created because of Vietnam and the Gulf War, but here's a much larger body of men, and many of whom, just like we've recognized recently, had a difficult time adjusting to this very traumatic experience. But they come back, I think, in general, more worldly, perhaps more cynical, perhaps more fatalistic. But in the long run, they come back as tremendous joiners in participants in a community. They understand what it's like to be a team player.
They found a different community. Right. When they got back, they found a lot of changes.
Right, and in a sense, KU starts to grow rapidly, because one of the things that's guaranteed to veterans before even the war is over is that they will have educational benefits. Well, the sunflower plant was going to stop making jet propulsion powder, but then you've turned the second industry that's still operating today. You're going to generate a tremendous demand for students. So KU goes to 6,300 in 1946 and then to 10,000 by 1947. So in a sense, as the plant winds down, the GI Bill means that soldiers are going to
picks up the
industry.
When these soldiers sailors and others came back. Many of them had been prisoners of war. They had a different challenge too, didn't they, psychologically and other ways, to adjust to being back home. And there were fears that many of them had been traumatized, incarcerated by the Japanese or the Germans.
Because of the duration, which is one of our themes of the program, but in one case, if you were captured, as one man I've met from Lawrence, who still lives here, he was captured in February of 1942. His picture appears in the Lawrence Journal-World in March of 1942 in his sailor uniform. He's 18 years old, and it says missing. Well, of course, missing in those days meant they haven't found the body yet. Yeah. And nobody was quite sure. And the Japanese did not always release the names of those they were holding sometimes for years.
Sure.
So what that meant was that this man was held as a prisoner of war for 44 months. And he comes back to a community which in a sense is, at least he can wear his uniform on the streets of Lawrence. He can be recognized, but still nobody's going to have a clue as to what he's been through.
Yeah. One of the things, that's changing the subject slightly,
right.
This thing is so fabulous, there's so much to cover, we can't do it. One of the things we haven't talked about are what the civilians at home went through in terms of rationing and the victory gardens and the drives that they carried on. Can you talk a little bit about that? We only have a couple of minutes.
Right, that's tremendously important, because the children, even if you're very young, can be participants in the scrap iron drives. They can be participants in the school bond drives. The estimates of what children made and how what children did, and here with the fruits and vegetables, children 13, 14, 15 years old worked in canning factories because the men were gone and the women were at Sunflower. And they learned lessons of responsibility, of dedication, of selflessness that stayed with them their whole lives. And so, you know, it's the primal event of anybody who, let's say, who was born after 1937 or 38.
Right, that age. Right. And the rationing, you had to have the stamps, they were allowed so much over a certain length of time to buy such things as tires and sugar, I believe butter.
Butter, and in fact they're told to collect animal fats so that they can use them for the glycerin to make gunpowder. So I mean there's
And they give you rationing stamps in return.
Right, and you only can use them, and then they were encouraged to use 3 gallons of gasoline a week.
Oh, there's too much here. We can't do it. Steve,
well, thank you for coming.
Well, thanks very much, and thank you for joining us. I tell you what, we're going to try to continue this series. This has been part 4. We're going to go on beyond this in the future and take a look at what happened in Lawrence beyond World War II, because there's a lot of significant changes there, too.
You bet. Thank you.
Hey, thanks for being our guest today.
You bet.
For us being your guest. And we'll see you next week.